Hi, I'm at the 2026 edition of Crop Diagnostic School. I'm here in Carman, Manitoba with Marla Riekman, Soil Fertility Specialist at Manitoba Agriculture. Marla, I think we've been dealing with a lot of excess moisture the past few weeks here in southern Manitoba. During your presentation today, I was listening to you and I was wondering what some of that has done to fertility plans that growers may have enacted in the spring, and how that's maybe negatively impacted, I'm thinking.
Yeah, we've had a lot of questions. I've had a lot of calls from agronomists and growers who've been dealing with flooded conditions. So not just, extra water, but like lots of water sitting on fields, and what that might be doing for, say, their nitrogen amounts that are left. Especially when you're still early in the season, early enough, there's a lot of nitrogen uptake still to be happening. And, is there anything left from what they put down last fall or this spring? How much is left? How much do you have to feed the crop in order to get that crop to its final kind of growth potential?
Okay, and that kind of leads into what kind of top dressing kind of practices a grower might want to implement, or at what point they feel it should be necessary. What are your recommendations there?
So generally speaking, we're doing assessments right now after, some of those flooded conditions have kind of dissipated. Might still be a lot of water still in the soil and saturated conditions, and saying, what's the yield potential look like right now? So if your crop is looking pretty decent, if it's looking like there's still a high yield potential even after that water has gone, then we may be looking at going back in and say putting up to 2/3 of that nitrogen requirement on the crop, assuming that a whole lot of it is gone. If it's not doing very good, if it's kind of more marginal, poor crop looking, you might not want to put much at all, or if it's more marginal, maybe up to 1/3 of what that crop requirement is. Some people are asking about soil testing. They have been going out and doing some soil testing in season right now to look at what is left. The issue with that is if that fertilizer had been banded, we want to know whether or not you're actually getting a good representation of what's available, because if it's banded and it hasn't dissipated too much, then you might need to take a lot more samples in order to capture some of that variability. And then also we have to recognize that if not all of the nitrogen has transformed into nitrate, that's not being picked up on a soil test. So any ammonium forms, organic nitrogen forms aren't being picked up on the soil test. And then too, depending on your soil type, if there was leaching happening with that nitrate, if it's moved down below the sampling zone, there might be some that the crop could still tap into. Of course, a lot of people, especially on our heavier clay soils, are more concerned about whether or not the denitrification or the gaseous loss has happened. And so, that can be a pretty big loss, especially if the water has been sitting for quite a few days. And so it's right that people would be concerned about whether or not that nitrogen that they put in the ground is actually going to still be there now for that crop.
So Marla, some of the standing water I've seen in some of these fields, one of the crops that comes to mind where it's not maybe doing so well is canola. What considerations are there for canola that maybe growers can maybe try and help their crop when they're dealing with that kind of excess moisture?
Well, I think here again, it's really looking at assessing what that crop stand looks like. So how set back has that canola been? And canola often kind of panics, right? And really doesn't do well in those excess moisture situations. And so in those cases with something like canola, we might not want to be looking at throwing anything more at it, because the consideration is that if it's been really flooded and that canola is really suffering, it might not actually recover quite the same as another crop, say like corn might. But if it's not been that wet, if it's been more, excess water conditions or heavy rainfall conditions, but not flooded conditions, that canola crop may still be looking okay. We might not have lost as much nitrogen, but another one that we might be concerned about for canola is sulfur. And so sulfur in that sulfate form may have some issues, because it's mobile as well, so it may be leaching. So if we have any potential for downward movement, then possibly, that sulfate has been also leaching. And for that canola crop, we want to make sure that we've got kind of enough for that crop. You can go in and top dress with sulfur if you have to. Sometimes the crop is rooted deep enough that it will actually access that deeper sulfate, and that'll be okay. If we're seeing yellowing in those canola flowers or anything like that later on, which is showing signs of a sulfate deficiency, then going in and top dressing with some sulfate would be an appropriate plan.
I think one of the biggest problems might be actually getting into the field to actually apply it, unfortunately.
Yes,
so,
exactly. That's always a problem.
Good seeing you again in Crop Diagnostic School. Take care.
Thanks, you too.